information only.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for coming tonight. Sorry for the banging. I didn't know any other way to get your attention. We're here tonight to talk about water. Water is one of our most precious natural resources. Everybody in this room uses it every day. Drinking, cooking, washing, cleaning, heating and cooling, sanitation, fire protection, agriculture, manufacturing. The list of uses goes on and on. Nobody in this room can live without water. No region can maintain or grow its economy without water. The fact that you all chose to come to this meeting tonight suggests to me that you probably know all of this already. But do you know how much water is available to this community? Do you know how much water is currently being used? Do you know where future water supplies are going to come from? If you're exceptionally well informed, you may know the answers to those questions. But if you're like most citizens, water's just there. We all tend to take it for granted. It falls from the sky, it flows from the tap whenever we turn the faucet. And as long as it flows, what is there to think about? In the summer of 1977, I visited San Francisco. And at that time, Northern California was suffering a severe water shortage. If you sat down in a restaurant, you didn't get a glass of water unless you specifically asked for it. If you went into a public restroom, there were signs over the urinals and toilets discouraging excessive flushing. They even inspired some poetry. If it's yellow, let it mellow. If it's brown, flush it down. Now, that didn't happen because San Francisco planned it that way. It was an unhappy surprise. We're gathered here tonight to talk about some planning that should prevent this region from having to endure similar unhappy surprises. My name is Thomas Schacht. I'm a managing member of Miller's Pond Company, LLC, which is a family partnership that owns Miller's Pond. Miller's Pond is the only remaining significant undeveloped surface water source available in this region. It's been studied by the City of New London and by the town of Waterford for over 40 years and has been designated in the water supply plans of both communities as a future water supply. In the rest of this evening, you're going to learn about how much water we have and about how much water we need. And from this information, you're also going to come to understand why there is a real and present water problem. You'll also learn about a proposal that has been submitted to the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection to bring Miller's Pond online as a water supply. And you'll learn why we think that there is a compelling case that this is the superior choice and why this should be done now. This meeting is not a formal public hearing. This is an informal public information meeting. Water resources are part of the public trust. And DEP and the state in general are concerned that when a proposal is made to use a major resource, that the public be informed. This meeting is part of the DEP required public information program whenever one applies for a water diversion permit. For about the next 45 minutes, I'm going to make a slide presentation. After this presentation, there'll be an intermission. For those of you who haven't had any cookies or other refreshments, you can take advantage of that at that time. And then after the intermission, there'll be a second part of this meeting. I'll try to hold it to an hour, during which we'll take questions and comments from the audience. You should have gotten note cards and pencils at your chairs when you sat down. Please use them to jot down your questions and comments during the presentation. After the intermission, when it's time, you can either stand up and ask your questions, or you can pass them forward on the cards and we'll just deal with them as they come. If you can't see this very well, the handout that you have has copies of all of the text slides so that you should be able to follow along there. Well, maybe you can give the folks a little bit more light so they can read what they've got in their hand. The parties in this water diversion permit are Miller's Pond Company, LLC, which owns Miller's Pond, Waterford Country School Incorporated, which is adjacent to Miller's Pond, and which has some historical connection with my family in the sense that my grandparents started Waterford Country School, but which is now an independent, nonprofit organization which has been that way for almost 30 years, but which owns some land adjacent to the pond and which will participate in this proposal if it comes to pass. The other parties who are here tonight are the Connecticut Water Company, which we have proposed as a private water company to construct and operate a water diversion facility at Miller's Pond. Bay State Environmental Consultants, who are here in their capacity as the engineering and environmental firm that wrote and submitted the diversion permit application. And Richard Cody, an environmental attorney from Mystic, who's helped us with legal aspects of this process. Next slide. You need to make that a little bigger. The map that you have on the front of your handout may be easier to see than this slide. I apologize for the quality of this one, but it was difficult to make a slide. The first thing I want to do is introduce you to the geography of what we're talking about here. This map is of the New London, existing New London reservoir system here. This is Miller Pond, and this is the Miller Pond watershed, or the Hunts Brook watershed. On the handouts that you have in front of you, the purple shaded area to the left contains the reservoirs of the existing New London system, and the orange shaded area to the right is the watershed of Hunts Brook and Miller's Pond. To show you where some of the major landmarks are here so you can get oriented, this is Route 85, running right down along Lake Kennewick. This is Route 395, running up this way. There's Miller Pond. This is exit 77, right here. So that if you followed Route 85 down there, you'd be at the Town Public Works Department, going on down to the Commercial Mall. This is Vauxhall Street Extension, coming out this way. This is Hunts Brook Road. Moxley Road going down into Quaker Hill. Hunts Brook Road continuing on up where it turns into Fire Street in Montville. Now, the part of your handout that is on the left, the purple shaded area, the existing Kennewick system, began to be acquired by the City of New London in 1871 with the purchase of Lake Kennewick. The amount of land that drains water into Lake Kennewick, or the watershed, is 8.86 square miles. That number is important because the amount of land that drains water into a reservoir tells you how much water that reservoir can collect. The Hunts Brook watershed, ending at Miller's Pond, is 9.83 square miles. In other words, this watershed is 11% larger than the watershed of the entire existing reservoir system. That, among other things, is what makes Miller's Pond such a vital water resource. It stands at a point in the geography where it has the capacity to collect water from that very large area. Let me show you some of the other environmental features here. Just above Miller's Pond, on the land of the Waterford Country School, is Lake Kuhika. On your map, it's that little lake just above Route 395. This is about 20 acres of water. This picture was taken 2 weeks ago. This is Hunts Brook flowing out of Lake Kuhika. This is just to give you an idea of what the environment looks like. Next slide. This is Hunts Brook above Miller Pond. This is just a short distance from where the brook itself enters into the pond. This picture was also taken 2 weeks ago. One of the things that you may be able to surmise from this photo is that this is nice water, that this is a pristine environment, and this in part is why the state has been able to designate Hunts Brook as among the top 25% of native brook trout habitats in Connecticut. Below Miller's Pond, in Quaker Hill, Hunts Brook continues on to Smith Cove, and there the state has a put-and-take fishery where they stock trout. Next slide. This is the Miller Pond Dam, viewed from across Miller Pond. The dam itself is 425 feet long from one side to the other. That's about 30% bigger than a football field. At the center, it's 22 feet high, about the height of a two-story building. And at the top, in the center, it's 40 feet wide. It's built of large granite blocks filled in between with mortar, and then the center of the dam is earth-filled. Next slide. This is a closer view. The person on top gives you some sense of the scale. Miller's Pond Dam is one of the largest privately owned dams in the state of Connecticut. Next slide. This is the new emergency spillway at the dam. This repair is about 95% complete. We will finish the Miller's Pond Dam repair next summer when the water level goes down again and we can get access into the areas that are currently covered by water. The person standing on the dam is my brother Rob, also the fellow here running the slides. He is the contractor who's responsible for all of this good construction work. If any of you have a dam to be built, contact him.
Don't call, please.
This is a rear view of the Miller's Pond Dam. I show this to you for one reason in particular. You notice that this whole area here is bedrock ledge. The dam is built on this kind of bedrock ledge, and that's a significant construction feature, particularly when it's compared to some other dams, including the dam at Lake Kennewick, which is simply built on whatever's under the soil, in that case, a very deep aquifer with sand and gravel being the primary component. A dam that is built on bedrock has a firm or relatively firm seal to its foundation, and as a result, the amount of water that leaks under this dam is minimal. At Lake Kennewick, in contrast, there's a significant problem with water leaking out from underneath the dam because the dam is simply built on sand and gravel. All right, now, having shown you the geography, let me turn on to the first question, which is, how much water do we have? The answer to the question, how much water do we have, basically comes down to the question of how much water do we have in a drought. How much water we have during a flood or during an average year doesn't really matter as much as the question, how much water do we have in a drought? Because you can't do without water for very long. So in water planning, you need to make your planning begin with the question, what do we need to have to survive a drought? The record drought for this region began in 1964 in the spring and continued through the end of 1966. That was the drought that dried up wells all over the town of Waterford, and it was the drought that first caused the citizens of Waterford to go to New London and ask to be connected to the New London water system. That drought is called the drought of record, and it's the standard against which water planning decisions are made. The amount of water that a water resource can produce in that record drought is called the safe yield. And safe yield simply means the amount of water you can get 99% of the time, even in that drought. Now, the question of how much water we have here, what is the safe yield of the current system, is a matter of some controversy. In 1988, the New London Water Pollution Control Authority reported that their safe yield was 5.4 million gallons per day. In the fall of 1988, the interlocal water agreement was signed, and then in the next year, 1989, New London reported the safe yield as having gone up by about a third to 7 million gallons per day. How that happened remains a mystery. Next slide. What we do know is that the state of Connecticut, shortly thereafter, questioned the accuracy of the 7 million gallon per day number and asked the city to perform studies to validate that number. Those studies have yet to be done. What has the town of Waterford concluded about the situation? Well, this is a quote from the 1998 Waterford Plan of Development, which was just approved this past October. I'll read it to you. State standards indicate that there may not be an adequate margin of safety between average water consumption and safe yield of the system. The future development of Waterford could be restricted by the inadequate safe yield of the system. Well, how inadequate is it? This is from the minutes of the Waterford Water Pollution Control Authority, dated October the 26th. In these minutes, the town's engineer is reporting back to the WPCA on the results of a meeting that were held in Hartford between Waterford and New London regarding the situation with respect to water planning in these two communities. Quote, the Department of Public Health believed the safe yield figure was more likely 5 to 5.5 million gallons instead of 7 million gallons, and would be looking for a consent order. The state also indicated that no diversion permits would be approved until there was a reliable safe yield figure, which could lead to a moratorium situation. Moratorium means no new connections to the water system until this problem is solved. It means no new growth. Now, the question really comes down to, are we ready for a drought in this area? Has our water planning adequately prepared us for that? The average level of the current water system for the last 28 years has been 74% full. As of February 1998, in a letter that was sent from the state to the city of New London, they noted that the reservoirs had only been full 4 times since 1970. And in the past 5 years, they've only been over 90% once as of the date of that letter. In 1987, we had a short drought. The reservoirs dropped from 96% in May to 29% in November, a 7-month period. And the average use in the system at that time was 4.68 million gallons per day, almost 1 million gallons per day less than we currently use. In July of 1998, the state of Connecticut denied approval for the water supply plans of the town of Waterford and the city of New London. In that denial, the state described the reservoir system as chronically stressed. This is the uppermost reservoir of the New London system 2 weeks ago. As you can see, it's sucking mud. There's not much water there. Are we in a drought? I don't know. I haven't been following the weather. But certainly, we're in trouble with water. When the reservoir was in this condition, New London was forced by state regulations to publish a water supply advisory. And some of you may have noticed that in the newspaper. That is one step above a phase 1 water supply emergency. This is the spillway at Lake Kennewick, also about 2 weeks ago. You'll notice it's dry. This is the place where water has only flowed out of Lake Kennewick 4 times in the last 28 years, as of that February '98 letter written by the state to New London. Turning from the question of how much water do we have to the question, how much water do we need, we can look at what the Southeastern Connecticut Regional Planning Agency says. Their 1997 Regional Planning Guide describes the significance of water to a region, and I quote, "Perhaps more than any other single factor, Utility infrastructure helps determine a region's development future. This is especially the case for public water and sewer. Without public water and sewer, each residence, each building would have to have its own well and its own septic system. That would mean that each residence or each structure would require several acres of land to accommodate its own utility infrastructure. That kind of development contributes to sprawl, whereas public water and sewer make it possible to have higher density development, villages, more efficient use of land. This is the Waterford Business and Economic Development Plan. This map is from the Waterford Plan of Development that was just approved in October. This area here is what's known as the Industrial Triangle. It's the major portion of undeveloped commercial and industrial land in the state, in the town. In total, Waterford has about 2,200 acres of undeveloped industrial land. Much of that land has remained vacant for many years. Why has it remained vacant? Well, the plan of development explains it this way. With increased competition to attract office and industrial uses, Waterford's strategic location, excellent infrastructure system of roads and utilities, low property taxes, and progressive regulation may not be enough to attract such economic development. So the view of the plan of development is that this land remains vacant simply because of excess competition. Here's another perspective. It doesn't say that competition isn't happening, but it points to one way that the town of Waterford is not competing effectively. In 1988 to 1990, based on figures in the old town water supply plan, the town of Waterford used, actual use, 750,000 gallons of water per day for industrial purposes. I couldn't locate figures between 1990 and 1993 anywhere, so I can't quote those to you. But I can tell you that from 93 to 97, that use dropped to 400,000 gallons per day. A fair amount of that drop may be due to shutdown at Millstone and to the general recession that the area was dealing with for a good number of years in the early 90s. However, look at the difference in projections for future use. In the 1991 water plan, the town thought that to support future industrial growth, it was going to need 1.4 million gallons per day. By 1998, when the town has to update the water plan, over the same period of time, the years 2002 to the years 2040, the town says they're only going to need from 630,000 to 820,000 gallons per day. Now, there's 2,200 acres of land, and only a couple of 100,000, maybe as much as 400,000 over the 40-year period, gallons of water per day to serve that entire 2,200 acres. Many industries require substantial amounts of water. If the town says that's all they've got to serve that industrial zone, that's another way of saying any employer, any industry that might need substantial amounts of water is going to have to pass this town by. Next slide. Let's move on from the issue of economic development to the more general issue of how much water does the region need. The water supply plans of New London and Waterford that were just submitted to the state earlier this year, the ones that weren't approved, did include projections of need over the current planning period. The current projection of need is 2.17 million gallons per day. That's how much extra water is needed. Now remember what I said earlier about the controversy over the safe yield number. This projection of 2.17 million gallons is based on the assumption that we actually have already 7 million gallons. But remember, the state thinks we don't have that much, and there's some pretty good reasons to think that. Hopefully some studies are going on to validate that. If the state is correct, then we will also need, in addition to this 2.17 million gallons, we'll need enough water to bring us up to the 7 million that was used as the starting assumption for this figure. That could be as much as an additional 2 million gallons a day. So the total need for New London and Waterford could be as much as 4.17 million gallons per day. Montville, their water plan says they need 1.25 million per day. The Mohegan Tribe development needs 1 million per day or more. East Lyme currently has a voluntary moratorium on new development in the town because they are functioning at their safe yield. They don't have any extra water. Old Lyme may need some additional water. The total for the region is somewhere between 5 and 7 million gallons per day. Where can water come from? Well, one possibility is conservation and recycling. In general, that's always the best place to get water from. Just use less. Conservation measures include things like public education, just teaching people how to use less water. It includes finding and fixing leaks. New London's water system is very old. I've been told that there have been some pipes in the ground that were really nothing more than hollowed out logs. And they're periodically ripping those out and replacing them. There is something known as non-revenue water use. This is water that escapes the meters in the system. It's used for other purposes. It may be used for flushing the water mains. It may be used for flushing fire hydrants. It may just leak. It may be used for purposes that don't have meters on them. This number is a significant factor in current planning for this reason. Over the past 5 years, the actual percentage of water use that is this non-revenue water use, this lost water, that percentage number in New London has been 21%. All the water planning has assumed that that number will be reduced to 15%. Now that's a worthwhile goal. That's what the state would certainly like to have happen. However, if the city is incorrect, if they're not able to achieve that reduction from 21% to 15%, then those figures for how much water is needed will go up by about 500,000 gallons per day. That's how much additional water will be needed on top of what's been projected. Next slide. Another way to conserve is to change your fixtures. This is a toilet rebate program in Los Angeles. Those of you who built a new house know that modern toilets only use 1.6 gallons per flush, whereas older fixtures use 3 gallons or more. Well, when you multiply that times hundreds of thousands or millions of flushes per year, it adds up to a lot of water. So the city of Los Angeles actually pays people $100 to take out an old toilet and replace it with a modern one. And this is the toilet recycling program. Back up to. Another way to get water, desalination. We've got the Long Island Sound out there. It's full of water. If we could take the salt out of it, you'd have more supply than you could ever use. The problem with desalination is simply that it's expensive. It uses a lot of energy. You have to heat the water up, distill it, and we are not like the Arabs who have our own oil wells to do that with. If there is a way to make desalination cost effective, ultimately it may be the solution for this region, but right now it's not. Another potential alternative source of supply is interconnection. Interconnection simply means you hook up your water system to another water system that has extra water, and then you can get that. The current town plan of development emphasizes interconnection as a desired outcome. The town says they would like to interconnect with Groton and Norwich as a way of getting extra water for the future. However, to use an interconnection for a permanent supply, as opposed to an emergency backup, the other community has to have so much extra water that they will never need it for their own use, because they have to be prepared to give it to you on a permanent basis. That's such an important principle that the state will not allow this kind of an interconnection for permanent use unless the community that is giving the water or selling the water can prove that they have this surplus and that they're going to have it for a long time. It's not at all clear that any of these communities has water that they are willing to give or able to give. Discussions have not occurred with those communities. there are significant technical challenges, such as getting water across the Thames River in case of drought. Now, I want you to note that the proposal that you're going to be hearing tonight about the use of Miller's Pond as a water supply is basically the same kind of a proposal. We are proposing that there be an interconnection with the Connecticut Water Company right here in Waterford. So that fundamentally what we are proposing is exactly what the town has already said they want to do in their plan of development. We're just suggesting they don't have to go as far as Groton or Norwich to do it. Another possibility would be for the town to get water from the Jordan and Nevins Brooks well site. If you go right down the road here, you come to the Jordan Cemetery. If you go through the Jordan Cemetery, behind it, there's a swamp. And in that swamp, there's 28 acres of land, give or take, that the town owns, which is very wet, and in which it would make technical sense to drill wells. There have been some problems with water quality. Some questions raised about water quality there. In 1984, when water quality studies were done, certain chemicals were found in that water, including some which are known to be carcinogenic at levels far in excess of EPA allowances. Some other water quality studies were done in 1989 which did not find those same chemicals. That could mean they're all gone. It could mean you only find them half the time. There are numerous old landfills in the aquifer which serves those wells, some of them having trash as deep as 40 or 50 or even 60 feet. All of those landfills were created prior to the time when the Environmental Protection Administration had anything to do with what happened in landfills. We don't know what's down there. This is the Jewish cemetery, which is across the street from the well site. This is Jordan Brook. The wells would partly be served by surface water. In other words, they would suck in surface water. So the wells would be sucking in some of the water from this brook if they were put online. What you see here are graves, including very recent graves, within about 10 feet of the brook's edge. In a Jewish cemetery, people are buried in pine boxes. The corpses are unembalmed. It's going to rain through that cemetery. That water is going to come into that brook, and it's going to be in the town's wells. The town brings those wells on for drinking water supply. Perhaps you can treat that, but I don't know how you treat the psychological impact of it. Next one. That's okay. There are two other options, and those involve diverting water from the Hunts Brook watershed. If you look on your handout, you can refresh yourselves as to where that is. One proposal, put forth by the City of New London, is to divert water from Hunts Brook Pond. The other proposal is the one we're here to discuss tonight, and that is to divert water from Miller's Pond. If you want to find Hunts Brook Pond on your map, start at Miller's Pond and go about halfway up that orange block, and you'll see a little blue splotch in Hunts Brook. It's about the size of a grain of rice. It's a little farm pond, about 3 acres in size. It was built in the 1930s. That is where the City of New London wishes to divert water. The plan is to put a pipeline from there over to Lake Kennewick and to pump the water out of Hunts Brook into Lake Kennewick. The pipeline would have a capacity, a maximum capacity of 8 million gallons per day. But most of the time it would be able to pump far less than that. 30% of the time it would be able to pump nothing at all. Because this pond is very small, it has virtually no significant storage capacity of its own. The only time water can be pumped from that site is in a rainstorm when there's extra water. The second proposal is to pump water from Miller's Pond, which, as you can see, is at the bottom of the watershed. Collects water from a much larger area, has much more water. I'm going to be talking more on a point-by-point basis about the comparison between these two alternatives as we go on. But first, let me talk about diversion permits, so you'll understand how these decisions get made. When a permit application is submitted to the state, the procedure is that after submission to the Department of Environmental Protection, the application then gets reviewed by the Department of Public Health, the Department of Public Utility Control, and the Office of Policy and Management. They all make comments back to the DEP, who makes the final decision. Before a permit is issued, there will be a public hearing, so that as the application that we've submitted goes forward, at some point in the future, there will be a public hearing. I can't tell you exactly when. DEP is in charge of the timetable. DEP acts on diversion permits according to criteria that are contained in the law, the Water Diversion Policy Act and the Connecticut General Statute, criteria that are contained in the regulations of Connecticut state agencies, and criteria that are contained in the Connecticut Conservation and Development Policies Plan. The main point to understand here is that a diversion permit is not a political process. You don't get a diversion permit because somebody voted for you. You get a diversion permit because it meets the criteria set forth in the law and the regulations. In particular, what DEP looks for is evidence that these criteria are going to be met. First of all, is there a need for the water? Second, can the plan to divert this water be done? Is it feasible? Can engineers build this thing? Third, is this plan prudent from an economic point of view? And prudent doesn't necessarily mean cheapest. What prudent means is, how do the costs appear in light of the benefits? What is the impact on economic development and creation of jobs? And what is the broad economic picture? There is the issue of environmental impact. In general, if there is an alternative which impacts or damages the environment less and is also feasible and prudent, then that alternative is to be preferred. And then finally, to what extent is the proposed activity compatible with state policy? To what extent, for example, does the proposed activity make conservation a priority? To what extent does it protect sources of water supply? To what extent does it deal with state policy priorities that say water systems should be interconnected and should be designed to serve regions, because that's good for a region as opposed to an individual community? And finally, to what extent does a proposal deal with uses for open space and recreation, because that's another state priority. The state, to the greatest extent possible, would like watershed lands to be open to the public and be able to be used for recreational purposes. The Miller's Pond diversion proposal has two elements to it. One part of it involves dredging the lake to remove silt, sand, and gravel deposits from the basin. This is designed to improve the water quality, to improve the amount of water that can be stored, and to improve the habitat for aquatic life. The existing conditions of the pond are on the left side. 77 acres of surface area, holds 191 million gallons of water in storage, has a maximum depth of 13 feet and a mean depth of 7.5. And the safe yield, the amount of water you can get out of there, 99% of the time, is 500,000 gallons a day. Plus, you can get additional water during rain events, which can be skimmed off. We're proposing a maximum skimming capacity of up to 12 million gallons per day. The total amount of water which can be gotten out of Miller Pond in an average year under the proposed conditions, which you see as 413 million gallons, 51 feet maximum depth, with a safe yield of 1.4 million gallons. The total amount of water, combination of safe yield and skimming diversion, is about 2.5 billion gallons per year. Now, I talked a minute ago about the idea of improving the habitat for fishes. There is a concept known as a tiered fishery. A tiered fishery is a fishery which has multiple different kinds of habitats within the same pond. You have some warm water areas which are suitable for warm water species like bass. You have some colder water areas which are suitable for other species like trout. In this case, what we're proposing to do with the basin of Miller Pond would create the possibility for a tiered fishery. This is some of the sand and gravel deposits in the pond basin. This is just to show you the kind of material that would be removed. Removing that material from the basin does not have to be done prior to its use as a water supply. There are technologies available that are clean that would allow that material to be dredged from the pond at the same time that it was being used for a water supply. The city of Groton is currently doing that with their reservoirs. Now, what's going to come next is a kind of a side-by-side comparison of the city's Huntsbrook proposal and the Miller's Pond proposal along important dimensions of comparison. The first one being a concept known as redundancy. Although we take great pains to protect reservoirs because they're precious resources, unexpected things can happen. In the 1980s, a car was found submerged in one of New London's reservoirs in about 15 feet of water. There was also another event in the 1980s in which a storm washed about 80 tons of soil from a commercial nursery area into one of New London's reservoirs. That soil could well have been contaminated with pesticides or herbicides or fertilizers, none of which you want to have in your water supply. There are lots of ways to deal with the risk that a water supply could become contaminated or lost for some other reason. But ultimately, it's not possible to remove all of the risk. And so there is a concept known as redundancy, which simply says a water system should have a backup. So that if for a reason that was unanticipated or beyond your control, you lose that system, you have something else to fall back on. Now, interconnection may be a good way to do that. If you're interconnected with another system, in an emergency, they can send you extra water. Currently, the New London system is not interconnected in any way that can provide them with additional supply. And the New London system has no redundancy. That needs to be put in the light of the fact that by the end of the current planning period, that system will serve almost 55,000 people. That's a lot of people to have no backup if something should happen. Some of you may recall seeing in the newspaper last year where the city of Boston almost lost their water system because of human error at the treatment plant and the handling of some chemicals. These things are not so remote. If you compare the contribution to system redundancy that would come from the Huntsbrook diversion versus Miller's Pond, here are some basic figures. The Huntsbrook diversion would be unable to divert water at all about 30% of the time under average conditions, and in a drought, that would be worse. You could go 6 months without being able to divert a significant amount of water. It would simply be too dry. In contrast, following dredging, well, Miller Pond has a safe yield all the time, but following dredging, you'd be able to divert 1.4 million gallons per day, even in the worst drought, every day of the year. There is no meaningful safe yield at all from the Huntsbrook proposal. That means you can't count on anything there 99% of the time, every day. The skimming at Huntsbrook during rain events or flood events can replace the entire New London system. There's a lot of water that comes down there at certain times. But it can only do that infrequently, less than 20% of the time, under what are known as ABF rules. Those are the rules for how much water you have to let downstream in order for fish and aquatic life to do well. I'll talk more about that in a minute. In contrast, the Miller's Pond proposal can skim the current total need of the system about 50% of the time under those same rules. In other words, about half the time, Miller's Pond could replace the entire existing system under average conditions. So that if there was a catastrophe, about half the time you have a complete backup. Now, we're not alone on this planet. We have a duty to respect that fact and to respect the fact that we share our natural resources with other species. The Huntsbrook diversion that the city proposes was originally planned back in the 1970s, before the Water Diversion Act was passed in 1980. Environmental standards were lower. Excuse me. The original plan was to divert so much water that only 60 to 70,000 gallons per day would be allowed to flow downstream. If you want to visualize how much water that is, imagine a cube 21 feet on each side and 21 feet high. 70,000 gallons. You could fit that much water in this room easily. That's all that was going to go downstream. Well, current standards won't allow that. So the Huntsbrook proposal was updated. The proposal was to release more water. But still, New London's proposal is only to release less than half of what the state requires. On the right-hand side here is the current state requirement environmentally for how much water has to be let downstream below a diversion point for maintenance of aquatic life. It's called the aquatic base flow. The Miller's Pond diversion permit proposes to meet the aquatic base flow requirements fully. That means 1 cubic foot of water per square mile of the watershed per second flowing past the diversion point from October to April. 4 times that much for 2 weeks during the spring to flush out the stream to make it suitable for fish spawning and so forth. And then 1/2 of this amount during the remainder of the year. The city's proposal is just to do this figure all year round. That's significant because the state has told the city they can't do this. And when the city has to do this, it's going to reduce the amount of water there that is available to divert. In fact, we did some recent hydrology of our own on the Huntsbrook diversion and determined that if New London follows these rules, during the period of record drought, they would be able to get about 840,000 gallons per day on average out of the Huntsbrook diversion. They would take that water not every single day, but in lumps during rain events. It would be piped over to Lake Canomic where it would be dumped into the reservoir. Some of it would then be lost to evaporation or to leakage from the reservoir. And the ultimate contribution to the safe yield of the system would be less. I can't tell you exactly how much, but it would be less. That figure has to be compared against what the need is, somewhere between 2 and 4 million gallons per day. It doesn't come close. A summary of the environmental values of the two proposals. The Huntsbrook diversion impacts 2 miles of Huntsbrook above Miller Pond. The Miller Pond proposal leaves that water alone. Remember, this is the area that has been designated by the state as in the top 25% of the brook trout habitats in the state. We don't know what impact the Huntsbrook proposal will have on the groundwater. It's not been adequately studied. We know something about what would happen at Miller Pond to groundwater because the pond has been drained for the past 16 years as part of the dam repair. If lowering the pond was going to affect groundwater in a way that was going to be a problem, it would have been identified by now simply by that. In fact, the periodic draining and refilling of the dam over the last 16 years really simulates, although it's more extreme, but it simulates the operation of a reservoir. So we've had a chance to see exactly what would happen. The City of New London, in its environmental studies, basically ignored Lake Cohica and Miller Pond. In fact, if you read the diversion permit application, what you will see is that they regarded Miller's Pond as not existing. Since it was drained temporarily to repair the dam, the city assumed it was drained forever. In fact, the Miller's Pond proposal will have net positive effects to Miller's Pond. The dredging will improve the water quality and improve the habitat for aquatic life. And then finally, in terms of environmental values, as I pointed out earlier, the city's proposal does not meet fully the requirements for water to be released downstream, whereas Miller's Pond does. Now, the town is also interested, as well as the state, in recreational activities. One of the things that's proposed in the Plan of Conservation and Development is an open space trail system. This is the open space plan from the Town Plan of Development. This area here is the area surrounding Miller Pond, which is right there. This parcel of land here in dark green is currently owned by the town of Waterford. as is this one here. The one on the top is known as the Sportsman Club property. This one is known as the Barry Farm. The other land surrounding the pond is owned by Miller's Pond Company, LLC, or by the Waterford Country School. And the pond itself, along with the water rights, are owned by Miller's Pond, LLC. Currently, that town land there and there are unused. This is the City of New London's approach to its watershed land. No trespassing, no hunting, no fishing, no dumping. It's probably necessary for the city to have this restrictive policy, even though the state encourages water companies to make their lands available for recreational use. Remember, there is no redundancy in the New London system. We can't afford to take a chance. We propose to make Miller's Pond available for recreational use as part of its development as a water supply. Now, that availability is contingent on permission from the state. It cannot be done without permission from the State Department of Health. But what we are saying is, if the state will permit it, we will not stand in the way. The Huntsbrook diversion will contribute nothing to recreation or open space development. Miller's Pond can potentially contribute fishing, other open space uses, including trails, wildlife corridor, greenbelt uses. You'll see over here on this model a architect's rendering of a golf course adjacent to Miller Pond. It's possible to construct a golf course in a manner that is entirely consistent with use of adjacent land for water supply. Golf courses exist like that in the state. They have to be managed carefully. You can't use pesticides, herbicides, artificial fertilizers, but that can be done. The material that could be dredged from the pond's basin could be used to build a golf course. And another possibility of the Miller's Pond proposal is that because there would now be some redundancy in the regional water supply system, it might be possible for the City of New London to reconsider its decision to have its lands closed. So it might be possible for those lands to be opened, consistent with state policy. Let's look at another issue having to do with efficiency of the operation of the water diversion. It would be possible to pump water from Miller Pond straight to the New London treatment plant, rather than simply piping it and dumping it into Lake Kennewick. The advantage of that is that any water that gets dumped into the lake is subject to loss from various factors, whereas water that goes straight to the treatment plant is 100% used. So the Miller Pond operation, at least for the portion of the diversion that could go straight to the treatment plant, could operate with virtually zero waste. Huntsbrook could do that occasionally, but not often. It could only do it when it's able to pump, and remember that diversion can't pump every day. The Huntsbrook diversion, because it will dump the water into Lake Kennewick, will subject that water to all the evaporation losses associated with Lake Kennewick. And remember, that lake has a huge surface area. Miller's Pond has about 75% less evaporation loss. Water in Lake Kennewick is subject to leaking to the reservoir. Miller's Pond Dam is built on bedrock. There's no significant leakage. In terms of how often you get to operate the pumping and pipeline system at its full capacity, the Huntsbrook proposal could operate at 8 million gallons per day about 12% of the time. Miller's Pond could, at the same capacity, could operate about 50% of the time. And then finally, pumping water from one place to another, if you're raising it, the distance you raise it is called head. Okay? To go from the Huntsbrook site along the pipeline route New London has proposed, the water has to be raised 250 feet. To get from the Miller Pond site to the same destination, the water only has to be raised 230 feet. So there's 20 feet less elevation, and that reduces pumping costs. Now, pumping costs are not a big deal in the overall scheme of a water system, but it is a point of comparison. What will it cost to build the infrastructure, a pipeline and a pumping station? This is an apples for apples comparison. When this was put together, we used the same unit costs per foot of pipeline and so forth that the city used so we could get a direct comparison. The pipeline distance is very similar. From Huntsbrook, it's 14,175 feet. From Miller's Pond, it's 13,500 feet. From Huntsbrook require that the pipeline go underneath paved roads for virtually its entire length. From Miller Pond, we can take the pipeline for about half of its length under the unimproved roads of the Waterford Country School, so that we only have to tear up half as much road to put the pipeline in. Hunts Brook, as I said earlier, has to pump in excess of its use. With the option of going directly to the treatment plant, Miller's Pond can pump only what's needed. Let's talk about conservation values, another point of comparison. Miller's Pond and the surrounding land is presently zoned for residential use. It's not protected as a water supply. Implementation of the proposal that's being brought forward now is consistent with the state policy for protecting water supply resources. And once Miller Pond was online as a water resource, the land could not be sold or converted to other use without permission from the state. As a result, bringing Miller Pond online as a water supply would protect that land for the benefit of the community, no matter what happens in the future. What are some of the economic and development impacts of the two proposals? Well, the Hunts Brook proposal has a lower capacity, has less water. So in comparison to the Miller's Pond proposal, it will limit support for growth. The Hunts Brook proposal does not make any contribution to a regional system. We propose that Miller Pond be available equitably on a regional basis to whoever needs it. Currently, many water systems in this area go to a town line and then stop. State policy discourages that. It doesn't make any sense. Those artificial political boundaries should not be water supply boundaries, any more than your electric power line should stop at a town line. The proposal that we have made would be 100% funded with private capital for the building of the pump station and the pipeline. Hunts Brook will come out of the municipal treasury. The utility that is created by the Miller's Pond proposal will be a tax-paying entity. There will be no new tax revenue out of the Hunts Brook proposal. And finally, if you look at the state policies with respect to conservation, source protection, recreation, interconnection, and so forth, you can see that the Hunts Brook proposal is not consistent with any of those, whereas the Miller Pond proposal is consistent with all of them. What will it cost? Well, first of all, let's look at the history of water rate increases. In 1991, the City of New London projected that water rates would increase 45% to cover the cost of the treatment plant, and then they go up another 30 or 45% to cover expenses associated with gaining a new additional water supply. The new supply is not yet online, but water rates have gone up 85% over the last 10 years. That's just the base rate. It's not the surcharge. During that same 10-year period, general inflation has been 36%, and the national average inflation for water rates has been 71%. That figure comes from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which did a survey of over 3,000 water systems in the nation. The proposal that we made to the City of New London for bringing Miller's Pond online would have this effect on water rates. The current surcharge rate for the first 1,000 cubic feet, that's the amount that most households are going to use per month. So that's the rate that most people are paying for virtually all their household water. To add Miller's Pond to the system, if Miller Pond provided 1/3 of the total system needs, would increase water rates by 4.3%, according to the proposal we made to the city. For the water rates after the surcharge is over, water rates would go up 8.3%. These figures here, $3,842 and $1,970, those are the cost per million gallons of water that customers are currently paying in the system. The figures for Waterford are a little bit different because Waterford pays different rates than New London. So, in summary, this is what we propose are the advantages of Miller's Pond as a water supply. More water with greater reliability, superior protection of the public health by bringing on a supply that brings redundancy to a system that doesn't have any. Superior environmental value, leaving 2 miles of pristine stream untouched and meeting fully the aquatic base flow requirements. Superior conservation value, taking land that is currently residentially zoned and bringing it into protected water supply status. Superior recreation value, making something available for recreation that currently is not. And finally, superior economic and development value by supporting the infrastructure that's necessary for those purposes. Now, if you want additional information about what I've been talking about tonight, there are several ways to get it. Any of you who wish to have a floppy disk in Microsoft Word format for Windows that has some key documents from the diversion permit, hydrology, and so forth, if you will leave a card with your request on it back at the table there, I will mail that to you. Public libraries in New London and Waterford have copies of our diversion permit application. Anybody got one here? Let me just show you what it looks like. This is the diversion permit application. It's hefty. You won't get through it in an afternoon. But it contains lots of technical details, and if you're interested in that, it's on reserve in the Waterford Library and the New London Library. The Waterford WPCA also has a copy. We're going to be putting up an internet website that will have some of these documents on it, and that will also have an email section where questions and answers can be posted. That's not operational yet. Should be within about a month. If you've left your email address there in the sign-up sheet, I'll be sure to email you a notice when it's available. You can contact somebody by fax or telephone locally. This would be my brother Rob. And then there will be a public hearing to be arranged by Connecticut DEP. It's time for intermission. Let's take about 15 minutes. I'd like to introduce a few of the people who are here to help me with your questions tonight. We've brought along some of the professionals who have been involved in this. Excuse me? Don't forget Neil. Neil, where are you? Dr. Neil Fennessy is holding up his hand in the back. Came here to eavesdrop tonight. He's a professor at the University of Massachusetts. He's a hydrologist, and he did the hydrology studies for Hunts Brook. Dr. Carlos Carranza, sitting here in the front, is an environmental scientist, and a principal with Bay State Environmental Consultants, who prepared the diversion permit. We have two representatives from the Connecticut Water Company here tonight. Mr. James McQueen, who's Vice President of Engineering and Planning. Mr. Terry O'Neill, who also represents that company. We have Mr. Keith Robbins, landscape architect, who's responsible for the design of the golf course. And we have Mr. Richard Cody, environmental attorney, who can deal with any questions related to the law. The way I'd like to handle this, the next slide, is to have you ask me the questions. I'll do my best to field them. Whenever possible, I will call upon these experts to help. I have some questions that have already been passed forward, and I think I'll start with these, and then we'll take questions from the audience. I like to run the meeting with Robert's Rules of Order. That basically means raise your hand. When you're recognized, you have the floor, and you have the floor until you relinquish it, or until I tell you you're out of order. Hopefully we won't have any of that here tonight. And we'll just proceed that way. Okay. First question. This is from a representative of Trout Unlimited. What are the plans for fish passage on Miller Pond Dam? Some of you may be aware that when the Miller Pond Dam repair was underway, the DEP expressed the desire to have a fishway there. The Miller Pond Dam has been there since the year roughly 1836. We don't know exactly when it was built, but that's the best we can figure from land records. And since that time, any fish that might travel upstream to spawn, what are called anadromous fish, have been unable to get past that dam site. The DEP is very interested in restoring those kinds of fisheries and wanted to have a fish ladder placed at the Miller Pond Dam. We have given the DEP permission to construct such a fish ladder. And in the repairs for the dam, we have included a sluiceway that would allow water to pass for the fishway. So if DEP is ready to build it, the dam is ready to receive it. There are two other questions here, which I'm going to turn over to Dr. Carranza. The first one is, how will you dredge without causing siltation downstream? How long will you dredge? And how does dredging improve water quality? How will we dredge without causing siltation downstream?
The preferred method of dredging will probably be by the use of a hydraulic dredge. Essentially, in the simplest terms, that would consist of an underwater vacuum cleaner, which discharges a slurry of sand and water through a pipeline and discharges that into a diked-in area, which we call a containment area. In that containment area, we separate the solids from the water, put the water back into the lake. That is being done presently by a design buyout firm for Connecticut DEP at Silver Lake in Meriden and Berlin, where 200,000 yards have been removed since 1996. It's a proven technology. We think it'll be absolutely applicable for Miller Pond. There's no turbidity because the only disturbance of the soil occurs right where the dredge contacts the bottom. And there's a shroud around the suction line, if we use that type of a system, that contains the turbidity right to the shroud itself. It basically is no bigger than the footprint of the dredge. You can actually, that's why we can skim water and divert it at the same time we're dredging. If the dredge makes hardly any noise unless you're right on it, it's a very small unit. It's tethered by a cable. The crew attending it is usually 2 people, maybe a third person on shore. It has no power of its own. It's tethered on the cable. See, so it's a very innocuous type of situation. It's not the old-fashioned clamshell, dig it through, throw the slop onto a truck type of deal. If you're envisioning that, that's not what we're proposing to do. Silver Lake for Connecticut DEP is the project to see.
Second question was, how does dredging improve water quality?
Water quality in Miller Pond is a function now, to a certain degree, of the amount of water that's available in the pond. Obviously, if we can improve the bottom conditions of the pond, the sand and gravel bottom, we have a much larger volume of water. And we also clean the organic deposits that are on the floor of Lake Cohica, which we also propose to remove. We propose to remove roughly 1 million yards of sand and gravel from Miller Pond, but about 60,000 yards of accumulated cultural sediments in Lake Cohica. Those sediments, when they are scoured, are carried into Miller Pond and cause turbidity and excess nutrients and that kind of thing. When they are removed, they're not there to cause that problem. The deeper water also creates a greater prism that we have available. It's sort of a dilution type of scenario, and that has the effect of giving us much clearer waters and much more productive waters in terms of the things we like, which are not algae and nuisance weeds.
And the third question was, how long will the dredging operation go on?
We used in the permit, we estimated a 10-year dredging program, but that can change. It can be significantly advanced if there's a desire to do that. And the reason we use that was to be conservative with the permitting agencies. It's based on the production of the dredge itself. Hydraulic dredge operates for about 7 months of the year and has an annual production of around 100,000 yards. So if you multiply it up by 10, you get 1 million. That's how we got the 10 years, roughly. However, we could use bigger dredges that can push much more solids, and we can process a lot more material a lot more quickly if there was a demand for it, or we had some other need or some other reason to do it. So the 10 years is an outside number. It's conceivable to do it in a lot less time.
Thank you. The State Department of Transportation is currently discussing plans for the widening of Route 85 along Lake Kennewick. Might this development put the current New London water supply system at greater risk? Mr. McQueen? You care?
Hopefully, the Department of Transportation would consider that public water supply when they're doing those improvements and would minimize that. But you can't ignore the fact that state highways in close proximity to drinking water supplies are not the best of neighbors. They can certainly be dealt with the problems on a planned basis, but it's always those uncertainties and those emergency situations that you can't plan for that have a way of happening. In this particular case, in addition to the normal type of traffic on highways that might bring in contaminants, the use of road salt, the use of things that we have to have for public safety are not always compatible with public water supply, and we try to minimize them. So if, in general, I think these things can be addressed, but there are something that certainly has to be resident within the design and a bit of luck. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. This one says, it has been said that the Schacht family is attempting to sell Miller's Pond for more money than it is worth. What is your response to this charge? Is it your long-term goal to sell Miller's Pond? The answer is, the long-term goal is not to sell Miller's Pond. What we have proposed here tonight is to develop Miller's Pond as a water supply. This is not a sale of the pond. If anyone has any follow-up questions on that, ask them later. The last question that was handed forward, about 25 years ago, the Schacht family claimed the pond was polluted due to fly ash dumped on the Chesterfield Road, leaching into the watershed. How does that affect the quality of water in Miller's Pond now? For those of you who are not familiar with this history, let me review it a little bit for you. Back in the 1960s, a contractor took ash that was left over from burning coal at the Northeast Utilities plant in Montville and dumped it in a couple of sites in the Hunts Brook watershed. At that time, there was concern raised about what effects this would have on the water quality. Numerous studies conducted. There was a lot of coverage in the newspaper. We were quite concerned about it. Okay. I'm reading from page 17 of a report by Hayden Wegman Engineers produced in 1994 for the Water Pollution Control Authority of the town of Waterford. It's titled Water Supply Program, Recommendations for Miller Pond, Water Quality Management, and Miller Pond Dam. Page 17 states, the ash landfills in the upper portion of the drainage basin do not appear to significantly degrade the quality of water. Their impact should be monitored. That's all it says. We did water quality studies as part of the diversion permit application. Water quality was acceptable as of the time we did the studies. That was last summer. Hunts Brook watershed is classified by the state as Class A or Class AA, which means that it's classified by the state as acceptable for drinking water. There are ongoing programs of water quality monitoring that are required for any water supply. Mr. McQueen, if you wanted to ask him later details, could tell you what the frequency of those water quality monitoring programs are, what has to be looked for. The basic answer is, obviously, Miller Pond will not become a water supply if there are water quality problems. The state will not allow it to happen. Our best information at this point is that there are not water quality problems now. That's the last of the questions by card, so we'll take them from the audience. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice.
You're welcome.
Perhaps you could enlighten us as to how the Hunts Brook diversion actually sort of came about, given that it's so far up, the stream, it basically cuts the collecting watershed in half. Is there some sort of logic, behind that when that plan was actually put forward?
I can only tell you what I understand the history to be. If there's somebody here from New London who knows this better than I do, please speak up. The original plan, as I understand it, for the use of the Hunts Brook Basin was to build a very large dam across the valley and flood several hundred acres upstream from that dam. That dam would have been built roughly where the current proposed diversion site is. The problem with that plan is that when it was formulated 40 or 50 years ago, it wasn't carried out. Under the current environmental laws, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to build a dam. That's part of what makes the Miller Pond Dam such a unique resource. It's there, it exists. Once it became clear that building a dam could not occur, then the question became, well, what else could we do at this site? The logical thought was, well, if we can't build a dam, at least we can just put a pipe in the brook and pipe the water over to Lake Kennewick. As I mentioned earlier, that plan was created at a time when environmental laws would have allowed the brook to be almost dried up by that diversion. The planning never got updated, as far as I can tell. And so the plan that's been carried forward to the present is essentially that original plan from many, many years ago that's just now continuing to be promoted.
My name's Gary Assert, I'm from Waterford. I just got two questions. Why is it that we couldn't dredge the existing reservoirs that the town of New London already has? I didn't see that become part of the topics, because if we've got these pumps that can work underwater, don't cause any problem, we make a bigger hole, we got more water. And the second question was, how much is 1.4 million gallons of depth in inches on your pond?
Okay, the first question was, why can't we just dredge the New London reservoirs and get more water that way? The answer is that dredging simply makes a bigger storage capacity. And the problem in the New London system is not storage capacity, is that there's not enough water to fill up the storage that exists. So if you dredged the New London reservoirs, you'd simply have more of an empty container. There has to be some way to fill those up, and that's the problem there. With respect to the question of how many feet and inches is 1.4 million gallons, the best way to think about that is with the concept of an acre foot. 1 acre of water, 1 foot deep, is about 325,000 gallons. So 4 of those, roughly, would be 1.3 million gallons. So 4 acres of water, 1 foot deep, is 1.3 million gallons. So it's close to the answering your question. Yes, sir.
Another aspect to the answer to the dredging question. Assuming you were going to dredge Lake Kennewick, you remember if you take that deeper, assuming you could improve it somehow doing it, you need to put the material somewhere. Now you could hydraulically dredge it, but you'd still need a large containment area. And we're talking about using an area 10, 15 acres for containment. Where is that?
If it happens to be gravel, that's where you're going to make your money, because there are going to be people buying it.
You still need to dewater it. You need an area to do that. You see, you have to have that. Then, because it's not a redundant system, you haven't got any alternatives. You can't excavate it mechanically, by dropping the reservoir down, because then you've disappeared your water supply.
Let me say something to that. The city of New London is actually currently preparing bids to have their reservoir system dredged, but they're using it primarily for what you just said, a revenue-raising production. It's not going to really help their system.
Okay. Next. Yes, sir.
Route 395 intersects the Hunts Brook watershed and Miller's Pond. Have you considered the environmental impact of this and what controls would have to be put in place to safeguard the water supply?
The answer to that question is yes. As you can see on this model over here, Route 395 travels directly through this northern corner of Miller Pond, and also Hunts Brook crosses underneath it. And the gentleman's question has to do with, are there any risks to the water supply from the fact that a road travels through it? The answer is yes, of course. Anytime a road travels through a water supply, there is the potential for an event to happen there that could cause contamination. There are also routine uses of roads that can impact water quality. such as the use of road salt or leakage from vehicles. The fact that a road travels through Miller Pond is not especially significant. You may recall, if you travel on Route 95 north, that road travels through the Groton reservoirs. If you take Route 95 south and you go through Branford, that road travels through Lake Saltonstall, which is the Haven Reservoir. So the presence of a road and a reservoir are not entirely incompatible, but certain protections are required. And there would need to be some improvements to the Route 395 drainage to protect the water quality here. In addition, there have been some proposals in the Miller Pond diversion permit to create some protective structures in the case of a catastrophe. If you had, you know, the once in 100 years event where a tanker truck went off the highway and careened into the pond, what would happen? Well, if you notice, Miller Pond right here is a very narrow area that can be segregated from the rest of the pond by building a dike across there. That dike can have control structures placed in it, which will allow this part of the lake next to the highway to be separated from the remainder of the lake. So in the event of some sort of a catastrophe, that could be put in place during the period of time when this part of the lake needed to be cleaned. The control structures might also be designed in such a way that water which was going to flow in here could continue to flow, but it would flow down low, to 8 or 10 feet under the water, so that if there was a petroleum spill, say, and petroleum of course floats, the water that did get through would be cleaner water from underneath that spill. So those are the kind of mitigation things that could be done. As well, there are some catch basins on the highway along here that would need to be improved and perhaps redesigned so that the flow off from the highway could be treated or diverted away from the pond. But those are all solvable technical problems.
In 402 of the Clean Water Act, the Federal Clean Water Act, which governs stormwater discharges, the new requirements of NIPDES require all highway departments in reconstructive efforts to employ best management practices. The discharge of stormwater from highways directly to any surface water would be not allowed. Any future reconstruction of these roads, we do a lot of work for CONDOT, and they are being employed everywhere. They must use those. And one of the best management practices here would be to divert the stormwater around Miller Pond. It's not impossible to do. As a matter of fact, it's quite easy. There's 6 catch basins that come out there. So that if they do reconstructive work there, we all know they will at some point, that will be done.
Yes, sir.
Wouldn't that be the responsibility of the state highway department in places like that to make sure that you have they put in proper buffer zones to take care of any such kind of an emergency? I think that it is the responsibility of the state highway department to take care of that particular problem that was brought up.
We've begun some discussions with the state highway department about this, and that's basically our position as well.
Comes down to funding, but realize that in interstate highways where they're getting pass-through federal money, that money will not be forthcoming without employing best management practices. That just isn't done anymore. It's the old.
Yes, sir.
Question about the Connecticut Water Company. But if the Connecticut Water Company became the supply distributor, where would the water supply end up? Where would it go?
We have proposed Miller Pond as a regional water supply. That means until the water's all gone, it will go to whatever community needs it,
How?
through a pipe.
Yes, but where is the pipe going to connect to?
Oh, okay. I understand. There are several options for where pipes could go from Miller Pond. Let me orient you again to this model. This is the base of the pond. Heading down in this direction, we're going to Quaker Hill or Uncasville. Going in this direction, we're heading towards Lake Conomic. All right? One possibility would be to put a pumping station or a water treatment plant here or here. Pipes could go in several different directions. To make an apples for apples comparison, what you saw on the slide earlier, we proposed taking the water to exactly the same place at Lake Conomic that the city did. That pipe would come up here, cross the land of the country school, go out to Vauxhall Street Extension, and then continue on to Lake Kenome. If there were a treatment plant here, water could go cross-country to Vauxhall Street Extension, where the town of Waterford has a large main, and finished water could enter the system right there. There's also a storage tank right there on Vauxhall Street. If a treatment plant were over here, water could come down Miller's Pond Road into Quaker Hill, or it could go out to the old Colchester Road and head down to Quaker Hill, or go to Uncasville or Montville in that direction. Still, another possibility would be to have either a pumping station or a treatment plant here, take water up here to the top of Barnville Hill, where it could then gravity feed into Montville or Waterford. So there are a number of options in terms of how to get water out of here. Another possibility would be to take water up or down Route 395 in either direction, depending on where it wanted to go. Does that respond to your question, sir?
I think you made a mention about it's connecting with existing Connecticut Water Company pipes.
If that were to happen, what has been discussed as a possibility in terms of what that company might be interested in is that the Connecticut Water Company currently serves Old Lyme. And when the region gets around to having an interconnected system, it would be possible to take water from Miller Pond through the New London treatment plant, through the town of Waterford and East Lyme, and you're at the Old Lyme border. So that the capacity to interconnect is there. This is what I understand in the water industry is called wheeling water around. It's where you pass water through somebody else's pipes. Electric companies do it all the time when they pass electricity over the grids of another company. Currently, Montville gets its water this way, through the pipes of the town of Waterford, from New London's reservoir. So this is a common practice. Yes, sir. I'm sorry?
Closest place is Old Lyme.
Where the Connecticut Water Company is actually active? Let them speak to that.
I can answer that question. The answer is yes. Old Lyme is the nearest water system that Connecticut Water Company currently owns and is responsible for. There are several, actually there are several over there, small shoreline systems that serve primarily seasonal cottage homes along Long Island Sound. This particular project might conceivably end up supporting some of those systems in the far distant future, but there's no plans for it now. There's no need for it that we can visualize right now. Those systems are all self-supporting over there and hopefully will be for 50 or more or 100 years. We don't envision anything changing there that would be significant. What Mr. Schacht has indicated is that this is a water supply project that's intended to be regional in nature, whether it's New London, Waterford, Montville, East Lyme, or a combination of those. It really makes no difference to Connecticut Water Company. Our business is producing and delivering water, and we're not really bound by political lines that change from one town to another.
Yes, sir.
You laid out 4, maybe 5 different paths of that water or pipe you take. A couple of them were gravity feeds. What was the 250-foot head or 230-foot head and the 7,000-foot of road disturbance based on?
Okay, that was based on the apples for apples comparison with New London, where the pipeline would come out here, cross the country school's land, out to Vauxhall Street Extension, and then down Turner Road to Lake Kenome. What the city of New London has proposed, could we have that slide? Where are we? Okay, this is New London's proposed diversion site right here. And the city wants to take the pipe this way, up Fire Street, back this way up East Lake Road, and then back this way to Lake Kenome. It's coming up this East Lake Road here where the city will encounter the 250 feet of head. That's quite a steep, big hill. By coming this way here, out to Vauxhall Street and then down, we avoid that mountain. And that's why the route from Miller Pond has less head. 20 feet less. Yes, sir.
Something has occurred to me. The place that New London was planning to divert Hunts Brook for their own purposes, that particular spot exists in the town of Montville. Does the city of New London have the right to come into a neighboring town without making some kind of provision with the town of Montville in order to extract water from a running brook? Seems to me that there are laws pertaining to the diversion of water in brooks, known as riparian rights. And I was quite shocked when I read it some months ago that New London was planning to come into Montville without any kind of proposition made to the people in the town of Montville. So my question is, what right, number one, do they have to divert that water without some kind of regional agreement?
Mr. Covey, you want to deal with that?
Probably about the best way I can answer that question is to be a little bit vague because the legislation on it's a little bit vague. New London was given by a special act a long time ago, more than 100 years ago, the right to condemn land within New London County and some of the towns. The statute doesn't say exactly which towns, but it is given some right of eminent domain. Assuming that it would have the right of eminent domain over private property in Montville, the issue of riparian rights would disappear because the city would own the surrounding lands. The land surrounding the water area, which the riparian rights adhere to. But it's not at all clear from that particular legislation what the city's rights are, because the statute goes on to talk about the fact that the water can only be condemned for use by the city itself. It doesn't seem to talk about the water being condemned for uses by other towns. So it sort of raises one legal issue.
I don't want to get into a legal discussion or argument here. That law was passed over 100 years ago, and things have changed drastically in the entire territory. Lake Conomic was deeded over to New London. I just read in the paper in 1871. When Montville, I don't even know if it was still in existence at that time, someone just told me that it was, but they required nothing at that time because there were maybe 5 people living in Montville. Today there are 17,000 people living in Montville. Now the point I am making, everybody's asking specific questions of how you're going to run a pipe here and how you're going to get the water there. All of those to me are technical questions that I'm sure engineers have the answer for. What I would like to point out to everybody here, that things are changing so drastically here that Uncasville has to take its water from New London through pipes in Waterford. We have no special water source of our own, except possibly Miller Pond, which is partially in the town of Montville. Now the whole area seems to be changing with the casinos, etc. We are now being talked about very openly that this is now recreational area. That means the shore, that means Groton, that means Montville, also Norwich is being financed, I guess, by the Pequots. New London is talking about developing their waterfront so that they become a great attraction. So this whole area is going to be pulling in thousands more of people other than the people who are residing here. I point out that the Pequots at the Foxwood, they have an average of between 50 and 60,000 people a day coming in there to use their water in every particular way. The Mohegans have over 20 to 25,000 people a day. Those are just 2 places. And they are now talking about, not they, but there are other people who are talking about building hotels. I see where there are at least 7 or 8 hotels that are being planned now. All of those places will require water. Now, if you don't get off your duffs and get this regional plan going, we're all going to be in trouble. I came back from a trip, I don't mean to make a speech, but I was in San Diego.
You're doing a good job.
I was in San Diego for a reunion of my old bomb squadron, and they are in a terrible shape down there. It's a big city. It's a hell of a nice city. They have no water. They took us over into a trip into Mexico. You ought to see what's going on down there. We went by 2 places. One was 12 stories high, the other was 10 stories high, built by American money, not government money, I don't think. Standing empty for the last 8 to 10 years. I don't know how many units there are there, but they don't have enough water to, I don't know how you go in it and spend all that kind of money and not have a water source or sewerage source. So you better think twice about what is happening here. I think you've got a tremendous water source if that can be developed, and that can be grubbed out. You'll have 3 times the amount of water or 5 times the amount of water, and I think it should go ahead, no matter what the obstacles are.
The New London Water Authority is a not-for-profit organization. With the involvement of Connecticut Water Company, which is a profit-driven organization, result in higher water rates than would otherwise be the case. First, let me point out that the City of New London has already discovered that the private sector can sometimes do things better. They've already privatized the operation of the water system because they found that by doing that, they would save money. We've discovered that ourselves in the reconstruction of the Miller's Pond Dam. The estimates that have been given to us by engineers from the town and the state were that it was going to cost somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million to complete the dam repair. We have done the work which you saw on those slides for about $150,000. Private sector efficiency at work. Now, the other thing I can say about water companies and utilities in general is that they are regulated, and that there are some rules about what can happen to rates. Perhaps Mr. McQueen would care to speak in more detail to that. I think the answer is it's not safe to assume that water rates from a well-run private entity are going to be worse than water rates from a not-so-well-run municipal entity. Another piece of this, and this is more of a philosophical statement about conservation and ethics and so forth, is that water in general is very cheap, particularly in relation to the benefits that it brings to people's lives. The base rate for water in the New London Waterford system, not the surcharge rate, but the base rate after that, is about 30% below what the Environmental Protection Agency surveyed as national average rates in 1996. So this area currently enjoys pretty cheap water, except for the surcharge. The surcharge jumps it up there. Now, in some parts of the country, or in some whole countries, water pricing is used as a tool for conservation. The idea being that if it costs more, you will use less, and you will take better care of this precious resource. The current water pricing scheme in this region does not take advantage of that principle. The first 1,000 cubic feet that you use costs more, and then whatever you use after that costs less. If you wanted to use water pricing as a conservation tool, you would reverse that incentive. Whether or not this community wants to take that step and make that kind of commitment to conservation, that's another matter. If Mr. McQueen, would you care to speak to this question about the Connecticut Water Company? And
I think you did a very good job.
Okay.
We certainly believe in efficiency, and the only way any private enterprise stays in business is to make a profit. None of us stay in business if we lose money. Yes, we intend to make a profit. There's nothing wrong with it. That's what makes this country strong and great and different from any other place in this world. But the prices have to be fair and reasonable, and we are a regulated utility, and we can't just charge anything we want. There is a long regulatory process that must prove what a fair and reasonable price is, and there are also limits on that so-called profit that we can make. And if we earn more than that, we are the first persons to reduce those rates, which we have done twice in the last 2 years when taxes have gone away and we passed those savings on to our customers. We are also the only private regulated water company in the state of Connecticut that has not raised its water rates since 1990, and we have no plans to raise the rates for water service that we provide in the near future. I don't know how long that will continue, but we certainly have no plans to raise rates for Connecticut Water Company customers over the next 2 or 3 years. There's no other utility, water, gas, sewer, or anything that can make that claim in the state of Connecticut, and I'm not aware of any other utility that can make that claim in this country. We're very proud of our record, and we think we can keep it going.
And that's part of why we hooked up with them. Dr. Francis, you had a question?
I just wanted to point out, in fact, that full cost pricing is a matter of state law in Massachusetts. There is no declining block rate. It's either a flat rate or a rising rate. So the first amount that you use does not become less expensive for the subsequent equal amount. It's flat or rising rate. It is state law. And it will probably happen in Connecticut, I would guess.
Yes, sir.
What's likely to be the impact on Hunts Brook downstream of Miller's Pond?
The aquatic base flow requirements, I mean, Tom went through that work, but those are going to be maintained. I don't know exactly the nature of your question. If it's turbidity and siltation, that's not an issue, because we're taking sand and gravel out in the
No,
basin.
the issue is about flow rate and the current the status of the dam when it's fixed. Will it be able to control the flow downstream, and how will that occur? In other words, for residents downstream, what will Hunts Brook look like?
Pretty much the way it looks now. I mean, what they're doing is a skimming operation during high flow events. So in some ways, I mean, that's actually a benefit in terms of downstream flooding effects. Take the peaks off those high flow events. But for most other events, I don't think you're going to see a difference. Neil, you want to say more about that? Is that accurate? In terms of what they're going to see in the stream? The peak events?
I think the aquatic-based flow notion is a little bit elusive, but I think what the rules essentially work towards is up to these threshold levels of stream flow, the operation basically has no effect on what stream flow would be in nature. So the whole point is, rather than the proposed early diversion that would dry up Hunts Brook at the Hunts Brook diversion, essentially this project would bypass those flows. They would flow through the reservoir and be actively released up into these thresholds. So the point being that the National U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has identified these as very important flow rates. This project would make sure that those are unimpaired.
Another point to keep in mind, downstream of the Miller Pond Dam, the stream for that segment is basically in a gorge-like setting, very steep. So changes in flow, large changes in flow are not visible in terms of water surface profile, because you've got such a slope that's contained in a gorge, more or less. It's not like a slow meandering stream like the section upstream, where a change in the amount of flow is noticeable by a shrinkage in the channel or something. You're not going to see anything like that.
Yes.
Yes, can you tell us what impact the proposal will have on the current agreement or arrangement between Waterford and New London? And will Waterford, in fact, be competing with New London to supply water?
The question was, what impact would this proposal have on the current agreement between Waterford and New London? And would Waterford be competing with New London to supply water? This proposal really has nothing at all to do with the current agreement between Waterford and New London. That agreement does not have to change in any way for Miller Pond to come on board as a water supply. Recall what I said earlier about the town of Waterford requiring or proposing to obtain its water through interconnection, and that what we're essentially saying here is you can interconnect at home. The bigger problem is not the agreement between Waterford and New London, but the relationship which surrounds that agreement. In order for Waterford, let's say, for example, Waterford came to the Connecticut Water Company and said, we'd like to make sure that the town of Waterford is going to have another 1.5 million gallons of water per day. We'd like to enter into a contract with you to supply that. Our proposal is that would be supplied through the existing treatment plant and the piping system and so forth. None of that would change. We would simply supply raw water to the system, which currently does not have enough to do that job. However, that could not happen, at least as far as I understand this, without New London's consent. That same issue applies to the wells that the town of Waterford has proposed at the Jordan well site. The town can't simply say, we're going to drill these wells and bring them on board unless New London says, okay, we will accept this source of water. So the real issue here is, can the town of Waterford and the city of New London get together and agree on any new source of supply, wherever it's going to come from? That's entirely beyond my control, with one exception. There have been some rumors that the proposal to bring Miller Pond on board has gotten Waterford and New London back talking together. If that's true, we've already accomplished a great deal. This stack of newspaper articles, about an inch thick, is the newspaper history of the negotiation of the last water contract between New London and Waterford. It took 8 years to consummate that agreement. It was described in the press as a water war, and it didn't come to an end until the city of New London said they were not going to allow any new customers to sign on in the town of Waterford until the town of Waterford signed a contract. Now, to my mind, that's a hell of a way to handle a vital regional resource. It is not our intention to recapitulate that history. We do not want to start that again. So, you know, in response to your question, what we're doing can work through the existing agreement, okay, but it will require cooperation from the parties. Okay. That cooperation is beyond our control. The state could come in and say, you have to. There could be a heavy hammer from the state. But that's the only, and that's kind of what was reflected in the minutes of the WPCA, where the state said if you don't solve the supply problem, there might be a moratorium. The state could impose that. Yes, sir.
Your answer to that last question sounds more like a power problem of political control rather than water going to the needy communities. So, in other words, it isn't about, with them, it doesn't appear to be about water. It appears to be about who has control of the water, has control over the surrounding towns. So, I have a question. You know, on your waste efficiency here, you say that to get the 8 million gallons a day through the Hunts Brook diversion would provide about 12% of the time they'd get that. Through Miller's Pond, they'd get it 50% of the time. So they're getting 20% of the amount they'd get by going through you, by piping it over to the current reservoir in Canoma, correct?
No, that's not quite an accurate way to represent the statistic. What that statistic referred to was how often the same system, the same pipeline and the same pumping station could operate at full capacity.
Which would be about 20% of the time.
New London could operate 12% of the time, Miller's Pond could operate 50% of the time.
So that's
Both of them could operate at less than full capacity at other frequencies.
right, but that, in other words, you're getting 20% of the product that you could provide. If they're only getting 12% of the time, you're getting 50% of the time.
But again, you're only talking about maximum use of that
No,
pipeline.
I'm talking about the maximum use of the pipeline.
That's correct.
So, well, what I was thinking is, you have a cow that's producing milk. And I want the milk from your cow. But I don't want to buy the milk from your cow. So I hire someone and I pay them 5 nights a week to run over into your pasture and milk your cow. But only one night of the week is your cow in the pasture, so I only get 20%, right? But it's still costing me to run over and have your cow milk, right? But I'm getting a smaller percentage back, right? And that's what this amounts to. It really, it breaks down to that. You know, and then if I can't get the milk from your cow, and there's probably some spillage from running through the field with that open bucket, if I can't get the milk from your cow in your pasture, then I'm going to steal your cow by condemning your property and taking it under eminent domain. What's the purpose of that It seems to me, over a period of years, and I'm in real estate, that Miller's Pond is a very desirable, developable piece of land. But you've held on to it for a purpose like this, to provide water for the surrounding community because you realize what it is. I mean, you probably could have sold this to developers a million times. So you're willing to work with all of the towns. There's no need for one town to stand up in this area. Now, in all of the towns around here, you've got friends or relatives in the surrounding towns around you. There's no reason for any one town to try and gain control over a water system that can provide water for all of the towns. And then, if that town gets it, the taxpayers in that town are going to have to pay to set up that water system, right, up front. They're providing it without any upfront money as needed. That doesn't seem like a problem. And not only that, no one has control over that water system. All the towns can share equally in it. Doesn't that make more sense than one town trying to gain control over the entire water system in the county? What's the purpose? And what are they going to gain by it? And is it a town, or, you know, is it the political system in a town? It doesn't make sense, and it's not fair to the surrounding towns, and it is not fair to the taxpayers.
When I was preparing my remarks for this evening, I came across a quote. I'll get to you in just a second, sir. I came across a quote from Mark Twain, which is very apt to that gentleman's comment. Mark Twain, a famous Connecticut author, said, "Whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting over." Yes, sir.
We're only hearing one side of the story. Why isn't New London representatives here to counter what you're talking about?
Is anybody here from New
your
London?
side of it, that's all.
Excuse me. Maybe I didn't understand your question. Could you repeat your
Why
question?
isn't there New London water officials here to counteract what you're saying?
Is anybody here from New London?
Yeah, there's an idea. Is anyone here from New London?
They were invited.
So they're not worried about it. If they were worried about the water supply, they would have been here fighting.
Well, I can tell you this, sir. We have attempted, in the conversations that we've had with the City of New London, to arrange for joint meetings. Last fall, I had a meeting set up with the New London WPCA, and I invited Mr. Blevins from the Waterford RTM to attend the meeting. I then called New London and told them that I'd invited Mr. Blevins, and New London said, if he comes, we won't have a meeting. We have done everything in our power to create a setting for joint discussions about this regional water situation. We can't take it any farther. The state has actually now told New London that they have to look at interconnection. The state has responded, given its initial response to New London's proposal to divert Hunts Brook. It just came back about 4 weeks ago. And one of the things the state has ordered New London to do is to evaluate Miller's Pond as a water supply, and also to evaluate all of the potential interconnection options in the region. Whether that means New London should come to this meeting or not is a separate question. They make their own judgments about what they're going to come to and when and how and why. And I'm not going to fault New London for being here or not. We have a lady here. We have a lady here from New London. Okay.
I am not a member of the WPCA of New London. However, I have been a London resident, a Waterford resident, and a New London resident. And I've listened to these battles for as long as I've been in the whole area. And I don't appreciate what the gentleman said about why should one town have the water. New London has built pipes all over the place to supply water to other people. That happens to be a fact. We also built the filtration plant out on Canal. So New London is not the bad guy all the time. And I resent people saying that. I am disappointed. I have looked around and I am sincerely disappointed that there are not more New London people here. I saw Mr. Beachy, who was the previous mayor of New London, here, but he's the only New London member that I saw. And I'm very disappointed because we have to listen to each other. I appreciate this whole thing. However, you said that nothing had, I believe it was you, said that nothing had been done about Hunts Brook and updating those studies. That's not true, because I went to more than one meeting out at Lake Economic where they discussed with very adamant discussions about people saying that they didn't want the water taken from Hunts Brook because it would dry it out and there wouldn't be any fish and all the rest of this. So, yes, it's been talked about, and that's got to be not more than 3 or 4 years ago. But we have to talk. This is Mr. Jager here is on, and I don't know how many other members of this group are on the regional water source. We've got to work together, because if we don't, the state's going to make us.
I agree completely.
And the simple fact is that New London owns the pipes. If you want to build another water system, which has been threatened God knows how many times around here, I think that would be a foolish mistake. We have to work together. We have to use what we've got and make it work.
Can't happen with the water.
Yes, sir, I'll get you next.
I was going to ask a question about the dredging in the lake and affecting the water table, and this gentleman's comment over here on the other side made me realize there's quite a bit of irony here that most of the Schacht family lives up on Hunts Brook Road, which is the north end of 395, which does not have any city water going up to it. Probably never will. I mean, there's got to be some irony there. That the Schacht family is willing to put their property up like this and share with the entire region.
Let me take that a step further, because that does bring up another issue of sort of equity and fairness in relation to this proposal. The way we have proposed to bring Miller Pond online, the cost of doing so would be financed through water rates. That means that people who live in parts of the town where they have wells and don't use city water would not be paying for this. That contrasts with any alternative proposal, which might be financed through general tax revenues, which means everybody pays for it, even if only some people actually use it. Yes, sir.
I didn't mean to offend New London. I'm from New London. But one of the statements you made before was that, and New London has put in the treatment plant and all the piping, one of the statements you made before is any of the water coming from your lake would be going into the New London treatment plant and going through their pipes. So it would you'd still be utilizing the New London system. Isn't that what you said?
Well, that is certainly one of the proposals we've made. It's possible for Miller Pond water to go directly to Montville without ever going through the New London system as well. So that remains possible here. But certainly to the extent that New London and Waterford would use this resource, it would go directly through the existing system. We're not talking about building a new water system. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to say that I appreciated what the lady said, and basically what she said is exactly what you've been saying all the time. We're talking about a regional plan, and what the lady from New London said is New London has the pipes, etc., and we have to all talk together. The conclusion that she made was exactly what this whole meeting is all about, that we have to get together on a regional basis, period.
I think we got time for 2 more questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, if you double the water supply watershed, as you said, and then increase the capacity significantly, and build a pipe and get to New London's reservoir and treatment plant, what's the average cost per typical family going to be?
I don't know. I can only talk about it in the percentage terms that I talked about up there. If anybody here knows what the typical family water bill is, add about 4.5% for the cost of bringing Miller Pond online. Okay. There would be additional costs related to new infrastructure and so forth, but that figure is the apples for apples comparison of New London versus, of Miller's Pond versus the Hunts Brook alternative. That's the cost of water from Miller's Pond. If your water bill is $100 every 3 months, then this would add $4.50 to that. Yeah.
I have a question. If Waterford and London have to solve a water problem some way that is going to interfere with Hunts Brook or Miller's Pond, what do you think would be the consequences to your
to talk about this from two perspectives. First of all, the political one. The proposal that we have made here tonight is a proposal that is not connected to any particular political constituency. It's simply, here's water, private utility company. It's not like if you build a shopping mall in my town that threatens, you know, the next town over, we're not going to give you water for it, that sort of thing. Okay? If either community alone were to control this resource, my expectation is that it would simply become a pawn in the continuing conflict. Waterford might like to have this so that in the next round of water negotiations, there'd be some leverage. New London might like to have it so in the next round of water negotiations, Waterford wouldn't have that leverage, and so on. If we pull this out of that political mess, we essentially lower the heat, lower the stakes on the next round of water negotiations. It's just water. It's there if you need it. With respect to the impact for the Waterford Country School, part of the proposal that we have made is that this is a joint venture, so that the Waterford Country School would share in the revenues for this. For those of you who don't know, the Waterford Country School is a private, nonprofit institution that serves handicapped and disadvantaged children. Lake Kahika is on the property of the Waterford Country School. One of the potential uses for this lake, in addition to helping control water quality in Miller Pond by catching sediment that comes downstream, is that it also provides another redundancy option here. If there was a catastrophe on 395 and Miller Pond became contaminated temporarily, until it could be cleaned up, the pipeline that went through Lake Kahika could be pressed into service and a skimming diversion could be put into place here. Thank you very much for coming. I said I'd stop after an hour and I'm going to stick to that.